It was a Tuesday like any other, or so I thought. I had spent the last 3 years perfecting my backyard garden, building my workshop, and creating a life I was proud of. My house wasn't as fancy as the other homes in Maple Grove Estates, but it was mine. I worked with my hands, drove an old truck, and had a simple, peaceful life. Little did I know that peaceful existence was about to be torn apart. I was standing in my kitchen, sipping my morning coffee, when I decided to step outside into my yard. But the moment I opened the door, I was hit by the overwhelming stench of raw sewage. My stomach lurched, and I nearly gagged as I looked down to see a bubbling, brown puddle spreading across my yard. It wasn't just a small leak. It was a flood of raw sewage pouring onto my property. My beautiful garden, the one I had nurtured for years, was now drowning in filth. My workshop, where I built furniture, was ruined, with my tools now soaking in this disgusting mess. It felt like a nightmare, but it was all too real. Panic set in. What had happened? Where was the sewage coming from? I immediately dialed the emergency line for the Maple Grove Estates HOA, praying they would fix this. After what felt like an eternity on hold, Karen Thompson, the HOA manager, finally answered. "Mr. Reynolds, what seems to be the problem?" she asked, clearly annoyed, as if I were the inconvenience. "There's raw sewage flooding my yard," I said, trying to remain calm. "My garden is destroyed. My workshop is ruined. This is a health hazard." Karen sighed. "Oh, it's probably just a temporary side effect of some plumbing changes we authorized in the neighborhood," she explained, as though that was supposed to make me feel better. "It'll be fixed next week when the maintenance team is available." "Next week?" I nearly shouted. "I can't live with this for a week." "Well, Mr. Reynolds, maybe you should have thought about drainage issues before buying a house here," Karen replied coldly. "Or maybe before building so close to the community line." Her words stung more than I expected. I had moved here 3 years ago, and from the moment I arrived, Karen and her friends on the HOA board had made it clear I wasn't welcome. My house wasn't as fancy as theirs. I didn't drive a brand new luxury car, and I actually worked for a living. I hung up the phone, feeling helpless, frustrated, and more than a little angry. I called the county health department next, but they told me they couldn't send anyone out until Friday, 3 days away. I was on my own for now, left to deal with this nightmare. As the smell filled my house, my dog, Rusty, refused to go outside. I spent the rest of the night unable to sleep, sitting at my kitchen table, staring at photos of my garden from last summer. The tomatoes I had won first prize for at the county fair, the kids from the neighborhood learning how to build birdhouses in my workshop. Those memories seemed like a lifetime ago, and they were being destroyed in front of my eyes. By morning, I decided I couldn't wait for help any longer. I needed to investigate the source of the sewage myself. I followed the flow uphill, tracing it back to where it was coming from. Behind some bushes on HOA common ground, I found it. A new pipe sticking out of the ground and actively spewing waste in my direction. I pulled out my phone, taking dozens of pictures and videos to document the crime. It wasn't long before I spotted Howard Wilkins, the HOA treasurer, walking his perfectly groomed poodle nearby. I called out to him, desperate for some answers. "Howard, come look at this," I shouted. He pretended not to hear me at first, but I wasn't going to let him ignore me. Finally, he strolled over, keeping his distance from the mess. "Oh dear, that doesn't look good," Howard said, his tone dripping with feigned concern. "I'm not aware of any installation like this. It must be a county issue." "Why is this pipe here?" I demanded. "This wasn't here before. It's dumping sewage right onto my property." Howard shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "You should probably call the county," he said, his face turning pale. "I'm not sure what's going on here." But I wasn't going to let it go. "You don't know anything about this? You didn't authorize this?" I pressed. Howard's eyes shifted nervously. I really don't know," he stammered, tugging his poodle away from me. "You should call the county. I'm sure they'll sort it out." I stood there fuming, watching Howard retreat. It was clear he knew more than he was letting on. I had just been lied to, and I wasn't about to let this go. The HOA had done this, and they were going to pay for it. Little did they know, my revenge was already beginning. The next few days were a blur of frustration and helplessness. Every time I stepped outside, I was greeted by the sight and smell of raw sewage flooding my yard. My once pristine garden was now a swamp of toxic sludge. My workshop was destroyed, and the stench had taken over my entire property. It was unbearable. I couldn't even sit inside my house without feeling the weight of the smell creeping in through the windows. I spent most of my time on the phone, calling anyone who might be able to help, but it felt like I was hitting dead ends at every turn. The county health department couldn't help until Friday. The HOA was doing nothing but sending me rude emails, and Karen Thompson, the queen of the HOA, was nowhere to be found. On day 3 of the sewage flood, I attended the monthly HOA meeting, hoping to finally get some answers. I put on my cleanest clothes and grabbed my tablet, filled with photos and videos of the mess in my yard. I was determined to confront them all. I arrived at the community center and took a seat among my neighbors, many of whom were pretending not to notice me. They wouldn't even look me in the eye. It was as if I was the one in the wrong here. The meeting dragged on with topics like lawn height regulations and mailbox color dominating the conversation. Every now and then, I would glance over at Karen, who sat at the front of the room, looking bored and indifferent. When my name was finally called, after what felt like hours, I walked up to the front of the room, heart pounding in my chest. "You have 3 minutes, Mr. Reynolds," Karen said curtly, starting a timer on her phone. I plugged my tablet into the projector, making sure everyone could see the photos and videos I had taken. "This," I said, pointing to the screen, "is what the HOA has done to my property. This new pipe, installed by the HOA, is dumping raw sewage onto my land. My garden is ruined, my workshop is destroyed, and my yard is unlivable. You are responsible for this." The room fell silent as the images flashed across the screen. The murmurs began, some people looking shocked, others avoiding eye contact. Karen, however, was quick to dismiss me. "That's not possible," she interrupted. "The HOA hasn't authorized any such installation. This must be a county issue." I wasn't going to back down. "Karen, you told me yourself on Tuesday that the HOA had authorized plumbing changes in the neighborhood. I recorded our conversation." I didn't actually record the call, but I needed to see her reaction. Karen's face immediately went from calm to furious. "Recording calls without consent is illegal in this state, Mr. Reynolds," she snapped. "I never said any such thing." I held my ground. "But you did say it," I pressed. "And now my entire yard is covered in sewage. My life is ruined because of this mess. And you're going to deny everything?" Karen's face turned beet red with anger, and she clicked her timer off, signaling the end of my time. "That's enough, Mr. Reynolds," she said, practically spitting the words at me. "You're done here." I grabbed my things and left, my frustration boiling over. But as I walked out of the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The neighbors who had looked at me sympathetically during the meeting now seemed to be avoiding me. But one older woman, who had been sitting near the front, patted me on the shoulder as I passed. "You're not the only one," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They did the same thing to me last year." Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. I stopped in my tracks. "What do you mean?" I asked, turning to face her. The woman sighed and glanced around nervously before speaking in a low voice. "They flooded my yard with sewage when they built the community center. They needed somewhere to redirect the drainage, and my property was the easiest target. I couldn't afford to fight them, so I sold my house at a loss. Karen's husband bought it, fixed the drainage, and resold it for double the price." My heart raced as I processed what she was telling me. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't just poor planning or a mistake. The HOA had deliberately flooded my property to force me out, just like they had done to her. They wanted my land, and they would do anything to get it. I left the community center in a daze, my mind spinning with what I had just learned. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw Karen and Howard standing at the edge of my yard, pointing at various areas and making notes. They quickly scattered when they saw me, but I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, knowing they were already plotting their next move. I couldn't sleep that night. The smell from my yard was unbearable, and my mind kept racing. Why me? Why my property? What were they planning to do next? And most importantly, how could I fight back? I knew I had to do something, but I had to be smart about it. The HOA had power, influence, and money on their side. But I had something they didn't expect: determination. I grabbed a notebook and began to write down everything that had happened so far. If this was going to be a war, I needed a battle plan, and I was ready to fight. The days that followed felt like an endless cycle of dread. Every time I stepped outside, I was reminded of the sewage disaster that had consumed my yard. The smell never left, and I could barely function under the weight of it all. My garden, my workshop, my entire property had been destroyed, and Karen Thompson and the HOA were doing nothing to fix it. I was exhausted and angry, but I knew I couldn't let them win. I couldn't sit idly by anymore. If the HOA wasn't going to take responsibility for their actions, then it was up to me to take control of the situation. I needed to come up with a plan, something that would make them take me seriously. I started brainstorming, gathering evidence, and documenting everything that had happened so far. Every conversation, every piece of information, and every detail of their wrongdoing was now crucial. I called Stanley Martinez, a plumber my friend had recommended. I needed someone who wasn't afraid to go up against the HOA. Stanley arrived an hour later in his beat-up truck with Martinez Plumbing, "We flush your troubles away," emblazoned on the side. He took one look at the sewage-covered yard and whistled. "Holy smokes, man, this is criminal," he said, shaking his head. Stanley brought in specialized equipment I had never seen before, including cameras that could trace the flow of the sewage beneath the surface. He spent hours digging small holes along the sewage path, muttering to himself as he followed it. By the afternoon, he finally uncovered something shocking: a large diversion pipe that wasn't on any public records. "This is no accident," Stanley said, pointing to the thick PVC pipe. "This wasn't part of the original plans. Whoever installed this bypassed the main sewer line, directing all the waste right to your property. They're saving tens of thousands of dollars by dumping the sewage here instead of fixing the plumbing properly." I felt a surge of anger. This was deliberate. This wasn't just some mistake or poor planning. The HOA had intentionally flooded my property to save money, and they were going to pay for it. Stanley wrote up an official report, documenting everything he had found, including photos and time-stamped evidence. I paid him extra to make sure everything was done thoroughly. As he was leaving, he looked at me seriously. "You know, these HOA types play dirty," he warned. "My cousin lost his house fighting one of these boards in Redwood Hills. They don't play fair." That was exactly what I needed to hear. I wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. I had my evidence now, and it was time to take action. With Stanley's report in hand, I marched straight to the HOA office the next morning. I wasn't going to let them hide behind their fancy office and pretend this wasn't happening. The office was a small suite in our neighborhood shopping center with gold lettering that read, "Maple Grove Estates, Excellence in Community Living." I walked in with my head held high, but Karen's assistant, Meg, blocked my path before I could even get to Karen's office. "Mrs. Thompson only sees people by appointment," Meg said without looking up from her computer. "This is an emergency," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I need to speak to Karen right now." "Sir, I'll need you to email your concerns to the appropriate committee," Meg replied, not even glancing up. I was done with the runaround. I held up Stanley's report. "This is evidence of illegal sewage dumping on my property. The HOA is responsible, and I need to speak to Karen now." Meg didn't respond, but through the glass door of Karen's office, I could see her laughing on the phone, feet up on her desk. When she saw me, her expression changed, but she didn't move. I snapped a few photos of the office layout, just in case it would be useful later. "Take the report," I said, leaving it on Meg's desk. "Make sure Karen sees it." I walked out, knowing that I had just taken the first step in fighting back. But as I left, I felt a cold chill of realization. This wasn't going to be easy. I knew that Karen and the HOA weren't just going to roll over. They had money and power on their side, and I had nothing but a few pieces of evidence and my determination. That afternoon, I checked my email and found something that made my blood run cold. The HOA had sent out a mass email to all residents, accidentally including me in the chain. The subject line read, "Reynolds Situation, Containment Strategy." I opened it quickly, and my heart raced as I read the messages. Howard, the HOA treasurer, had written that the diversion pipe was necessary to save money on repairs to the main sewer line. Karen had responded, saying that my lot had always been meant to be a drainage point. If he complains, Karen wrote, we deny everything. He can't afford legal action, and by the time the county inspector responds, we'll have our story straight. One of the board members added, his house is the cheapest in the neighborhood anyway. Should have never been approved. I nearly fell out of my chair. This was a calculated plan to drive me out, to force me to sell my property, and they had been lying about it all along. They thought I was powerless. They thought I wouldn't fight back. I forwarded the email to my new anonymous account and printed 3 copies for safekeeping. They had no idea what they had just done. The next morning, I went to the county records office to dig deeper. I needed to know everything about the HOA's actions. I spent hours going through the records, and I found something interesting. The HOA had never filed permits for the plumbing changes to the community center. This was huge. Without the proper permits, their entire operation was illegal. But there was one more thing I needed: backup. I called a few neighbors who had seemed sympathetic during the HOA meeting. I invited them over for coffee, hoping they could help me gather more support. By the time they left, 5 people had agreed to join me in my fight. We formed a group called Maple Grove Homeowners for Fair Treatment, and together we began to collect stories from others who had been mistreated by the HOA. I knew I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. That night, I called my cousin Ryan, who owned Reynolds Concrete. You still willing to help me with that special delivery? I asked. He agreed without hesitation. I now had a solid plan. The HOA had no idea what was coming for them. The battle was about to escalate, and I was ready. But I knew this would be a fight unlike any I had ever faced before. It was time to show Karen and the HOA that they had messed with the wrong homeowner. The days that followed felt like a blur of planning and action. I couldn't afford to waste any more time. My property was in ruins. The stench of sewage was ever present, and the HOA had made it clear that they didn't care. The longer this dragged on, the harder it was to maintain any sense of calm. But now, with the support of my neighbors and the damning evidence I had gathered, I was ready to take the fight to them. I spent the next few nights combing through the HOA bylaws, state environmental protection laws, and building codes. I knew every legal loophole they had exploited and how they had manipulated the system. I wasn't just going to fight them with emotions. I was going to hit them where it hurt the most, legally. But I also knew that playing by the rules wasn't going to be enough. The HOA had broken the law, and they had done it with the knowledge that they could get away with it. That had to change. The next morning, I visited the County Environmental Protection Office. The clerk behind the desk eyed me warily when I walked in, but when I handed her Stanley's report, her eyes widened. This is serious, she muttered, reading through the report quickly. We'll send an inspector out tomorrow. But the wheels of government move slowly, and I knew I couldn't wait another week for action. I left the office feeling frustrated, but I had one more move to make. I needed to reach the media. I'd spent the last few days collecting the most damning evidence, including the email chain where Karen and Howard had admitted to their actions. I compiled everything into a well-documented report and emailed it to the local news stations. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to make sure the public knew what was happening. As the days dragged on, the sewage in my yard continued to fester, and the smell only got worse. My dog Rusty refused to go outside, and I couldn't even walk across the yard without stepping into the muck. It felt like my life was being swallowed by the mess that Karen and the HOA had created. Then one afternoon, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, it was a violation notice. Improper yard maintenance, it read, along with a fine of $100 per day. They were fining me for the mess they had caused. I couldn't believe it. Not only had they flooded my yard with sewage, but now they were punishing me for the condition they had created. It was the last straw. I called a meeting with my neighbors that evening. 20 people showed up this time. I passed around copies of the letter, the email chain, and all the other evidence I had gathered. Together, we began to understand just how deep the HOA's corruption ran. Jennifer Williams, the woman in a wheelchair who had been denied her ramp 3 times, stood up and spoke. I paid $7,000 to install my wheelchair ramp, she said bitterly. They fined me for not adhering to their rules. They're nothing but bullies. Michael Chin, another neighbor, chimed in. They fined me $500 a day for installing solar panels on my roof. Solar panels that are protected by state law. They don't care about the rules. They just care about making money and pushing people around. It was clear to me now that the HOA wasn't just targeting me. They had been abusing their power for years, manipulating the rules to enrich themselves and crush anyone who dared to stand up to them. But we weren't going to take it anymore. That night, I called my cousin Ryan again. "We're moving forward," I said, my voice steady. "The HOA won't listen to reason, and the authorities are too slow. I've got a plan, but I need your help." Ryan listened, then agreed, though I could hear the hesitation in his voice. "This could get messy," he said. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," I replied. "The only way they'll learn is if we hit them where it hurts. Hard." The plan was simple but risky. We would flood the HOA office. Literally. But not with sewage. I had a different idea in mind. Industrial foam. Ryan's company had used this eco-friendly foam on a recent project. It looked and felt like concrete, but could be removed with a special enzyme solution. The foam hardened quickly, forming an impenetrable barrier. It would disrupt everything inside the office but wouldn't cause permanent damage. It was the perfect way to send a message without destroying their property. We spent the next few days preparing. I gathered the supplies, gloves, masks, a burner phone, and the foam itself. Ryan made sure the truck was ready to go. Everything had to be perfect. If we were going to do this, it had to be quick, precise, and clean. The night before the operation, I sat in my truck, parked a few blocks away from the HOA office, staring at the building in the dark. My mind raced with thoughts of what could go wrong. Would we get caught? Would the police show up before we finished? But then I thought about everything I had lost, the garden, the workshop, my peace of mind. And I knew this was the only way. I checked my watch. 1:58 a.m. It was time. Ryan's truck, covered with magnetic signs reading county maintenance, pulled up beside me. We got out, masked up, and made our way to the back of the office building. It was dark, and the streets were quiet. We'd been watching the office for days, and we knew it would be empty at this hour. The first step was getting inside. We used skills I had picked up from YouTube videos to pick the back door lock. The sound of the door creaking open was almost deafening in the silence, but we slipped inside undetected. The office was dark and empty, just as we expected. The smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, the faint echo of Karen's previous smugness still lingering in the room. I directed Ryan to set up the hose through the mail slot, and once it was in place, we began pumping the foam inside. The thick gray liquid poured in, filling the room inch by inch. It was slow at first, but then it began to spread, covering everything. Karen's desk, the filing cabinets, the computers. I made sure to focus on the records that contained all the altered property maps and documents that had enabled them to justify their illegal actions. We worked quickly, moving from one area of the office to another. The foam began to harden, forming a solid mass that covered everything in its path. It was the perfect crime, disruptive, but not permanent. By the time we finished, the office was completely filled with the foam. Nothing was left untouched. Ryan and I exchanged a quick look. "We need to go," he whispered. We slipped out the back door and vanished into the night. I didn't know what would happen next, but I did know one thing. Karen and her HOA would never forget this. They had messed with the wrong person, and I was done playing by their rules. Tomorrow, everything would change. The next morning, I awoke with a rush of adrenaline and a knot in my stomach. My eyes flicked to the clock. 7:15 a.m. The sun was just beginning to rise, and already I could hear the distant hum of traffic outside my window. Today would be different. I was sure of it. Today, the HOA would finally be forced to face the consequences of their actions. I couldn't help but replay the events of the night before. The moment we finished and walked away, I had felt a strange combination of relief and dread. The deed was done, but I knew that this was just the beginning. The foam in the office would be the spark to ignite everything else. But what would happen now? Would they immediately connect the incident to me? Would I go to jail? These thoughts kept racing through my mind as I stared out my window, heart pounding. Then, just as I was about to shake off my nerves and get on with the day, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a car pulling into my driveway. I froze. It was too early for anyone to be visiting, especially after the events of last night. I looked through the blinds and saw an unfamiliar blue sedan pulling to a stop. A man stepped out, dressed in a suit holding a briefcase. My stomach dropped. Who was this? What did they want? Before I could gather my thoughts, the man was at my door, knocking briskly. "Mr. Reynolds?" he called, his voice professional. "My name is Daniel Wright. I'm from the District Attorney's Office, Environmental Crimes Division." My heart skipped a beat. Environmental crimes? Yes, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I believe we need to have a word," Daniel said, his face serious. "It seems the issue you've raised with the Maple Grove Estates HOA has attracted some attention." He glanced at the folder in his hands. "And we have some evidence we'd like to discuss with you." I stepped back, motioning for him to come inside. "Of course," I said, trying to act as if I wasn't on edge. As Daniel sat down at my kitchen table, he opened the folder, pulling out several documents. "First off, I want to let you know that the HOA has been under investigation for the past 6 months for several serious charges, including environmental violations, embezzlement, and fraud. What you've experienced is part of a much larger picture." I blinked in disbelief. "They've been under investigation for months?" Daniel continued. "We have evidence showing that the sewage diversion on your property was not an isolated incident. The HOA has been manipulating the system for years, cutting corners and using their position to line their pockets." He slid a few pages across the table toward me. "These are records that show they've been falsifying reports and approving illegal changes to the neighborhood's infrastructure." I felt a mix of relief and anger wash over me. The truth was coming to light. It wasn't just my property that had suffered. The entire community had been exploited by these people for years. "And the concrete in the office," Daniel said, looking at me carefully, "that too has caught our attention. We know the HOA president, Karen Thompson, and others in the board have been involved in fraudulent activities, and we believe that your actions last night may have inadvertently provided the final piece of the puzzle." I sat back, trying to make sense of his words. "So you're saying—" "I'm saying," Daniel interrupted, "that you've just become a crucial witness. The timing of your actions coincided with some key events we've been tracking. What you did is not what I would have recommended, but it helped move our investigation forward. It's put the final pieces into place, and now we're ready to make our move." I was stunned. I'd never imagined my actions would lead to this, but now it seemed like everything I had done was pushing the investigation into high gear. "But," Daniel added, his tone softening slightly, "I need you to be careful. This is about to get very public, and I don't want you to get caught up in something bigger than you anticipated." I nodded, trying to digest everything he was telling me. It was surreal to think that everything I'd been through, the frustration, the lies, the sewage flood, had finally pushed things to a breaking point. The HOA would be exposed, and Karen and her cronies would have to answer for what they'd done. Before Daniel left, he turned to me with one last piece of advice. "You've got a lot of people backing you now. Neighbors, the press, even the county. But the HOA still has a lot of power, and they'll try everything to save themselves. Be ready for that." I thanked him as he left, his words echoing in my mind. It was clear now that this was more than just a battle for my property. It was about taking down a corrupt system that had been abusing its power for too long. Later that morning, I checked my phone. A notification from a local news outlet caught my eye. It was a breaking news alert. "District Attorney investigating Maple Grove. Estates HOA for environmental violations and fraud." I couldn't believe it. The story was already out there. The HOA was on the brink of collapse, and everyone was starting to see the truth. The next few days were filled with activity. The press camped out in front of the HOA office. The county inspectors began taking samples from my yard, and the neighbors who had supported me started sharing their own stories of mistreatment by the HOA. It felt like the walls were closing in on Karen and her board members. They could no longer hide from the consequences of their actions. But even as the investigation intensified, I knew that the fight wasn't over. Karen was a fighter. She had power, influence, and a history of using underhanded tactics to get what she wanted. She wouldn't go down without a fight. I couldn't rest until the job was finished, and the HOA was held accountable for everything they had done. That evening, as I stood in my yard watching the news coverage unfold, I noticed something strange. Through the haze of the ongoing investigation, I spotted Karen. She was standing near her office, her eyes scanning the chaos around her. She knew this was it. The end was near. But what I didn't expect was the cold smile she flashed my way, as if to say, "This isn't over yet, Reynolds." I clenched my fists. It was far from over, but I was ready for whatever came next. The battle had only just begun, and now Karen Thompson would know that when you mess with the wrong homeowner, there are consequences. The final chapter of this war was fast approaching, and I had every intention of making sure that Karen and the HOA paid the price for their greed. It had been a week since the media storm erupted, and things were moving faster than I could keep up with. The pressure on the HOA was mounting. Neighbors who had been silenced for years were coming forward, speaking out about the injustices they'd faced. The county health department had finally issued an official statement condemning the actions of the HOA, and the district attorney's office had begun gathering their evidence against Karen and the board members. But I knew better than to relax. Karen and her cronies were cornered, but they were dangerous animals. They had a lot of power, and I didn't trust that they'd go down without a fight. That evening, as I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing the new developments with my neighbors, I received an unexpected knock on my door. My heart skipped a beat. This was the moment I had been waiting for, but part of me dreaded it as well. I opened the door cautiously, and there, standing in front of me, was Daniel Wright from the district attorney's office. "We need to talk," he said, his voice grave. I stepped aside, letting him in, and we sat down at the table. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in the air that made my stomach churn. "I have good news and bad news," he said, not wasting any time. "The good news is that Karen Thompson and the rest of the board are being charged with multiple crimes, including environmental violations, embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. We've got the evidence we need to bring them to justice." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. I'd fought back, and it was finally paying off. But then Daniel's next words wiped that relief away. "The bad news is that Karen has a network of people in powerful positions who are trying to protect her. The investigation is getting more complicated, and there's a very real chance she'll try to manipulate the situation to escape punishment. She knows we're closing in on her, and she's not going down without a fight." I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. I had known this wasn't going to be easy, but hearing Daniel lay it out so bluntly made the stakes feel so much higher. "We need to keep up the pressure," Daniel continued. "If Karen gets wind of any cracks in the case, she'll exploit them. But we also need to be careful. She's been doing this for years, and she's not afraid to use dirty tactics to get what she wants. We have to be prepared for her next move." I nodded, my mind racing. I had already been through so much, and now it seemed like the stakes were even higher. The investigation was about to reach its climax, but it was clear that Karen wasn't going to give up without a fight. She had been the mastermind behind the manipulation, and now it was up to us to ensure that the truth came out. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. The media coverage intensified as more and more residents came forward with their stories. There was a sense of unity in the neighborhood, something that hadn't been there before. People who had been intimidated into silence by the HOA's power were now speaking out. The momentum was on our side, and I couldn't help but feel like we were on the verge of a major victory. But then, just as I thought things were moving in the right direction, I got a phone call that turned everything upside down. It was from Jennifer, the woman in the wheelchair, who had been one of the first to speak out against the HOA's abuses. "You need to come over here," she said urgently. "They're here, the HOA. They've sent someone to my house." I was on my feet in an instant. "What do you mean? Who's there?" "It's Howard," she said, her voice shaking. "He's with someone else. They're threatening me. They're telling me I have to take back everything I said, or they'll make things even worse for me." I could feel my blood run cold. Howard had been one of the biggest supporters of Karen's manipulation, and if he was involved in this, it could mean serious trouble. "I'm on my way," I said, grabbing my keys. By the time I arrived at Jennifer's house, I found her standing in the doorway, shaking with fear. Howard was standing on her porch, his face twisted with anger. There was a man with him, someone I didn't recognize, wearing a suit and sunglasses. He looked like trouble. "Jennifer, what's going on?" I asked, my voice firm. Howard turned to face me, a sneer spreading across his face. You think you've won, Reynolds? He spat. You're just stirring up a hornet's nest. You and your little group of troublemakers have no idea what you're up against. I stepped forward, standing between Jennifer and Howard. This ends now, I said, my voice cold. You can't intimidate us anymore. The man in the suit stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Mr. Reynolds, he said, his voice smooth, you should know that the HOA has powerful allies in the local government. They've been very generous to the right people. If you continue down this path, you'll be making enemies you can't afford to have. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. I knew exactly what was going on now. They were trying to intimidate Jennifer and me, using their connections to threaten us into backing down. You can threaten us all you want, I said, but you're not going to stop us. The truth is out, and there's no going back now. Howard's face twisted with rage, and he stepped toward me. You'll regret this, he snarled. But before he could say another word, I turned and walked into Jennifer's house. Get inside, Jennifer, I said, my voice steady. We're not backing down. Howard and his companion stayed outside for a few more minutes, but eventually they left, knowing they had no power over us anymore. As soon as they were gone, I turned to Jennifer. They're scared, I said. That's why they're trying to intimidate us. They know they're losing. Jennifer nodded, her face pale but resolute. I won't be intimidated anymore, she said, her voice firm. None of us will. The next few days were tense. The HOA was clearly on the defensive now, and they were pulling every trick they could think of to save themselves. But they had underestimated us. We had the truth on our side, and there was no way we were going to let them get away with it. As the investigation moved forward, the pressure on Karen and her board members continued to build. It was only a matter of time before they would have to answer for their crimes. The public outrage was growing, and the news stations were picking up more and more stories about the corruption within the HOA. By the end of the week, the DA's office had announced that they were pressing charges against Karen, Howard, and several others in the board. They would finally face the consequences for everything they had done to the community. But as I stood there, watching the news coverage, I couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. The battle had been long and hard, but we had won. The corrupt HOA was finally being exposed, and Karen Thompson's reign of power was coming to an end. As I looked out at my garden, now starting to recover from the sewage mess, I knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter, for me, for my neighbors, and for Maple Grove Estates. And for the first time in a long while, I felt hope. The future was bright again. The final chapter in this fight had unfolded in a way I could have never predicted. The pressure on Karen and the HOA continued to build, and when the day finally came for the public hearings, everything changed. The courtroom was filled with people who had come to witness the consequences of the HOA's corruption. Karen, Howard, and the rest of the board members were standing trial, but the once unshakable confidence they had exuded was now gone. The evidence was irrefutable, and the truth had finally caught up with them. As the case went forward, the news media reported every detail. The secrets, the lies, the manipulation, they all came to light. The community watched as Karen and her colleagues were brought to justice. They were charged with multiple crimes, including environmental violations, fraud, and embezzlement. Karen's smug expression that had always irked me was replaced with a look of disbelief. The woman who had caused so much pain and suffering for so many was now facing the consequences of her actions. But it wasn't just the HOA that was on trial. It was the entire system that had allowed them to operate unchecked for so long. The scandal led to widespread reforms within the community. The new HOA board, led by Jennifer, was committed to making things right. The power structures that had enabled the abuse of homeowners were dismantled, and the residents of Maple Grove Estates began to rebuild not only their homes, but their trust in each other. As for me, I took a step back. The fight had been exhausting, and while I had been at the forefront of exposing the corruption, I was no longer interested in continuing the battle. I had done my part, and I was content with the changes that had taken place. My yard, once a toxic wasteland, was beginning to bloom again. My workshop, though still needing repairs, had hope of being restored. The most important thing was that my community had reclaimed its power. Looking back on everything, I realized there was more than just a victory here. There were lessons. lessons that would stay with me for the rest of my life. The lesson. The first and most important lesson was about standing up for what is right. For too long, I had let the HOA walk all over me. But when I decided to fight back, I did so with everything I had. The road wasn't easy, and I faced countless obstacles along the way. But I didn't back down. I showed that even one person, no matter how powerless they might seem, can make a difference when they fight for the truth. The second lesson was about the power of community. I couldn't have done this alone. From the very first moment, it was the support of my neighbors, people who had suffered in silence for far too long, that gave me the strength to keep going. When we came together, our voices became louder, our resolve stronger, and our impact undeniable. The HOA thought they could isolate us, but they underestimated the power of a united community. The third lesson was about never underestimating your own strength. I didn't consider myself a fighter. I was just a guy who liked working with my hands, tending to my garden, and keeping to myself. But when my home and livelihood were threatened, I found a strength within myself that I never knew existed. The determination to protect what was mine and to stand up for others became my driving force. It wasn't just about the sewage or the property. It was about standing up to injustice, no matter how big or small. And finally, the most profound lesson was the power of patience and persistence. The fight wasn't quick. It didn't happen overnight. But every action I took, every phone call, every document, every step toward justice led to this moment. It taught me that things worth fighting for often take time. The important part is to never lose sight of the goal. You must keep moving forward, no matter how many setbacks you face. As I sat in my yard, the sun setting behind the newly repaired workshop and my blooming garden, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. The battle was over, and my life was starting to return to normal. But the lessons I had learned would stay with me forever. I had fought for my home, my rights, and my community, and I had won. In the end, justice prevailed, not just for me, but for everyone who had been silenced by the HOA's power. And as for Karen Thompson and the board members, well, their reign of corruption had come to an end. They were held accountable, and the changes they had fought so hard to avoid were the very changes that would restore fairness and honesty to the community. This was my story, but it was also the story of everyone who has ever fought for what's right, no matter how impossible the odds. Never give up. The truth always has a way of coming to light, and when it does, justice will find its way through. I smiled as I sat on the porch, watching the birds return to my garden, the very same birds that had once seemed like a distant memory. It wasn't just the land that had been restored, it was the soul of the community, and in some ways my own, and that was the true victory.